So, as I mentioned in the last video, starting in the 60s and 70s, societal groups began to pressure government. And this led to a diffusion of power throughout the country. Now, there are a couple things that also advanced this diffusion of power. First of all, there were reforms in Congress designed to diffuse power within government. Political parties also began to lose their grip to an extent over the political process. And furthermore, as these new kinds of governmental organizations arose to meet societal demands, the degree of complexity in government has increased. And this complexity within regulations of government also serves as an additional check on the government. I'll talk about that a little bit later in this module. So, business interests, of course, have also began to coalesce, just as society interests began to coalesce during the 70s. And some examples of business interests coalescing into larger organizations include what we'd call a peak association. A peak association is a group that represents the political interests of a variety of companies and industries. Of course, the one that we typically think of is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We also have the National Association of Manufacturers, and that represents 10,000 companies and 350 trade associations. There's the Business Roundtable, which consists of about 100 CEOs, consists of about 160 CEOs. Another group that is representing a coalition of business interests is what we call a trade association. And a trade association is a group that represents the interests of an industry or an industry segment. There's about 6,000 trade associations in the United States, but they typically represent a sole industry or industry segment, in contrast to the peak association, which can represent multiple industries or companies. Now, a lot of these corporations do have staff, large staff groups of like relations experts in Washington. And most of these companies, of course, most corporations have what we would call a Washington office. So the Washington office is typically, ironically, located in Washington, D.C., and that's typically set up by a corporation, a peak association, and or a trade association, and is staffed with experts who work to advocate a firm or an association's point of view to lawmakers and regulators. In other words, they translate what those groups want into bite-sized pieces that politicians can understand, and this can form an agenda. Now, some business interests can form coalitions as well to create broader support in a coalition. A coalition is this combination of business interests, such as corporations, trade associations, and peak associations, and they're united to pursue a common goal. So you can probably get the feeling that we're going to be talking about lobbying in the next video. But the thing I want you to take away from our kind of discussion here, whether you're looking at a corporation, a peak association, a trade association, or any of the representatives of their Washington office, the whole point of what we're trying to discuss here, this is a way for business interests to translate what they want into something that a politician can understand. Furthermore, they can pool their resources in such a way that a politician doesn't have to deal with 100 different corporations to figure out what's going on. They just deal with one representative in the Washington office who can represent a broad coalition of interests. It's a way for them, in some ways, to represent their constituents or understand their constituents a little bit better. Of course, this coalition of interests, this pooling of resources, can also be to the detriment of society, because societal groups may not have the resources of a coalition, peak association, or trade association. So as we're kind of keep this in the back of your mind as we're discussing lobbying, using money or resources is a way of making your free speech just a little bit louder to politicians. So it's a way of making the stuff digestible and understandable, but also kind of making your own free speech louder and possibly drowning out the voices of other groups. So we're going to start our discussion of lobbying in the next lecture, and I will see you then.